Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be working on some picture frame DIYs. Before we get started today, I wanted to introduce you to my new Etsy store, The Whimsy Curio. For the past few months, I have been collecting and working really hard on all of this vintage art. Most of what is in my store right now is public domain art, but when you find public domain art, sometimes the aspect ratios of those original art pieces just do not fit a bunch of different frames, and the coloring may be off due to aging. So I have been editing and fixing the aspect ratios of all of these art prints so that they will fit into many different sized frames. In the coming weeks, I plan to add a lot more art to my store, including some very unique art that is my own art. I am going to make it available for downloaded prints. I'm currently working on a Halloween collection, which will include a bunch of public domain art pieces as well as my own art. So definitely be on the lookout for those coming soon to my store. And right now I have a special sale going on for my subscribers and my followers. You can get 20% off if you use the code FRIENDS20 at checkout. And in today's video, I am doing a giveaway for one free piece of art out of my store. All you have to do to enter this giveaway is comment art on today's video. I'll be announcing the winner on June 10th. For this first project, I found these pretty oval frames from Dollar Tree. It's pretty hard to find oval frames at my thrift store, so when I saw these at Dollar Tree, I knew I could make them over to make them look a lot better. The first thing I wanted to do was get rid of that hideous bright yellow gold frame that this was. While I do love gold, this just was not the color gold that I enjoy. So I figured, why not do some spring colors? These are actually meant to be chalkboards, and since it already had that chalkboard backing, I left it in the frame and decided to color wash these. The first one I used moss green from Waverly Chalk Paint, and the second one I just mixed up a pretty purplish pink color. Now I wanted to keep these frames pretty simple since they are color washed. I wanted that to show through the most for these frames, so I decided to just use these little cameo molds that I got from Amazon and just make two different ones to go inside my frames. This first one is a little frame that has a rose in the center, and then for the second one I'm just using a generic little cameo with the little lady on it and making a larger frame for that to fit inside. And I made sure to actually leave the center piece of my frame in the mold. Then to finish these off, I'm using some wood glue and attaching each one of these to the inside of my frames. I decided to put the little lady on the green one and the rose on the purplish pink one. And if you don't have any cameo molds or little frame molds, you could just use any of your clay molds, maybe put some flowers or some birds on here. For this project, I picked up this frame that kind of has this beveled edge to it, and I thought it would be perfect to make a tray. Now to make the bottom of this tray, I'm going to be using 7 of these thin Dollar Tree wood planks, and unfortunately these were just a tiny bit too big to fit down in this frame, so I did end up having to cut about an inch off of each one of these pieces. Then I decided to just paint my frame with some of my white chalk paint, paint, and this took about 2 to 3 coats to finish. And for the wood planks, I decided to just stain these, so I'm using some brown acrylic paint with a wet rag to do that. And then once those were dry, I'm taking what was left over on my paintbrush from painting my frame, and I'm just dry brushing a little bit of white over these to make it look more weathered and old. Then I lined up all of my pieces down in my frame as evenly as I could, then used some wood glue to put these all down on the bottom side of the frame. I also decided to embellish the frame with some of these brass corner pieces, so I just used some gel super glue to put those on there. And finally, for this tray, I wanted to add a little bit of pretty detail on it. So I'm using this little vine stencil that I got from Amazon and some of my white chalk paint and putting this right in the center. For this project, I found this pretty little art frame at the thrift store, and the main thing I was looking for when I picked this particular frame up was a frame that had a matting inside. But if you can't find a frame that already has the matting, you can always just make sure that you pick up a larger frame and then you can create your own matting for it. So the first thing I did, of course, was take this entire thing apart. I'm gonna set that matting aside for now, and then this frame also had an interior trim molding that I wanted to keep, so I peeled that off of the backing. Then I'm going to use some European gold rub and buff and go over my entire frame and also over those little interior trim pieces. Then I set all those pieces aside to dry while I worked on the matting, starting by going over it with 1 coat of my white Waverly chalk paint. I wanted to make this matting a little bit unique and for it to stand out in the frame. So I'm going to do a textured raised stencil on here using a little vine and floral stencil that I got from Amazon and some Dollar Tree spackling. And as I'm doing this, I'm just kind of moving the stencil around randomly and putting that spackling over it. Once the spackling had completely dried, then I went back over this with a second coat of that white Waverly chalk paint. Then all I had to do was just put my frame back together and add some pretty art. I'm using this fondant mat that I got from Amazon. It has this really pretty lace flowery detail. So I'm going to be using some of my air dry clay and I'm going to roll this out and use this for a 5x7 frame. I kind of wanted to make this look like embroidered paper. So I'm rolling this out really thin over my fondant mat. And then I am taking a piece of paper that is 5x7 and I'm going to very gently cut this down to size. Now, like I said, I did roll this out pretty thin, so you want to be very careful when you're pulling this up, but look how beautiful that detail is. I'm going to lay that aside to dry overnight, and while I'm waiting, I am going to go ahead and work on this frame. I picked up just a generic wood frame from my local thrift store, and of course, I did want to embellish it a little bit, so I just used some Amazon molds that I got and made some little corner pieces just using hot glue. Now, once I had those corner pieces glued down, again, just using hot glue to do that, I took this outside and spray painted it with some Rust-Oleum metallic gold spray paint, but I wanted to dull that down a little bit, so just using some of my European gold rub and buff, I went over the entire frame to dull that down. The next day, once the clay was dry, I was able to just pop this back into my frame, and the backing fit over it quite nicely, so I was able to just reuse that as well. To decorate this frame, I'm actually going to be using these little cross-stitch frames. I got these at my thrift store, but you can find these in any craft store, even Walmart has them. And I'm also going to be using these beautiful butterfly stamps that I got from Amazon, and I'm just picking out 3 of these that I like, and I'm going to stamp these down onto a scrap piece of drop cloth. And as always, if I am able to link what I am using, it will be linked in the description box below. So I will have these, and I also have some drop cloth linked on there as well. So once I had the stamps finished, I just used a pencil and traced around the frame so I could cut these out. Now I also wanted my small frame to match my larger frame, so I'm just going back in with a little bit of that European gold rub and buff and going over this small frame. On the inside of this small frame, there's a little lip, so I'm just using some hot glue and doing a bead of hot glue all the way around this frame, and then I was able to just press this down into the frame. I just used a small pair of scissors to trim off any excess that was sticking out. To hang the smaller frame from the larger one, I'm using these little eye hooks that I got from Amazon, and I did end up having to snip the top of that smaller frame so that I could get this through the little hole, but it's not even noticeable. For this next project, I found this cute little oval frame from my thrift store. Now, if you're like me, it's kind of hard to find oval or round frames. So when I found this one, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. So I started by taking that back piece apart, and I had planned on using some of my basswood to make a background for this. But luckily, once I took this apart, I was pleasantly surprised to find that there was already a wood piece in the back of it. But if you don't have a frame that already has a backing, then I have some basswood linked below in my Amazon store that is super easy to cut down. So I just started by removing that glass piece, and then I popped the wood piece back down in there and closed it back up. Then I went in with 2 coats of my plaster chalk paint and painted this entire frame and the backing piece. And honestly, I think this project would be really pretty in any different kind of spring color. Pink, blue, green, I think they would all turn out beautiful. So I wanted to make a 3D butterfly kind of art piece for this. So I'm using this little butterfly mold that I got from Amazon, and I'm just making a ton of little butterflies with my air dry clay. And once I made a whole bunch of these little butterflies, I started by gluing a larger one to the outside of my frame, and then just kind of glued them going in a diagonal direction across this entire frame, so it kind of looked like the butterflies were coming out of it. And as I moved upward across the frame, I decided to lift some of the butterfly wings. Now, if your clay is still really wet, you may want to let these butterflies dry for just a little bit so that when you shape those wings, they'll stay in place. I waited about 24 hours for my butterflies to dry, and then I went over them with that same paint color I used on the frame. For this project, I picked up this cute little shelf that had a scalloped edge on the front of it, and also a picture frame that's a 5x7 that was kind of sort of the same wood tone. My first intention was to leave this the wood tone that it is, but you'll see further in the video, I just could not deal with the oranginess. But the plan for this is actually to flip that shelf upside down and use it for a frame stand. Of course, I had to add some pretty little detail to that very plain frame, so I'm just using this wood applique that I got from Amazon, and to kind of make it match more of that wood tone, I did go in with some Waverly antiquing wax and go over this little piece. This was when I was still planning to leave it this wood tone, but later on that will change. Now here I'm just marking that shelf and also the picture frame. I'm going to drill some holes into both of these pieces, and that's actually how I'm going to attach this frame to the shelf to make the stand. I'll be using some dowel rods to push through those holes on the shelf piece and into the frame. Now that I had my holes lined up and drilled, I attached that pretty little applique to the top portion of the picture frame just using some wood glue, and then I let that set for a few hours. And while that was drying, I am going to go over that dowel rod with some antiquing wax, and once this is all dry, then I cut my pieces down to push through into the shelf and into the holes that I drilled into the frame. And because I made sure that my holes were a little bit snug, I didn't have to use any wood glue or anything, just pop these dowels right inside those holes. And it was pretty much at this point that I realized I just could not take the orange brown color. I know in the video it doesn't look quite as orange as it did in person, but it was very, very 80s orange. So I decided to just lighten this wood tone up a little bit by doing a faux wood look on here, starting out by going in with some of my chalk paint in the color plaster and going over this entire thing with just one coat of that. And once it was dry, I had to take the entire thing back apart so that I could do the faux wood look on it. Now you could just go over this with some antiquing wax, but I wanted this to be more of a lighter wood tone. So I ended up just making my own waxes. I used some of Waverly's clear wax, and then I chose some light creamy tannish brown colors to add a few drops of acrylic paint into the clear wax. Once I had the first layer of the lighter creamy tan color on top of both of these pieces, I let those completely dry, and then I went in a second time with a slightly darker wax that I made. And I made this one the same exact way, just using some Waverly clear wax and then dropping a few drops of acrylic paint into that wax. Then again, I let this second coat completely dry on both pieces. Then to add a few darker highlights, I did the same thing again, using some Waverly clear wax and a few drops of really, really dark brown paint. But for this layer, I am just going to brush this on very quickly, and then I will wipe off a lot of the excess with a paper towel before it dries. Then all I had to do once all this was dry was just pop this frame back onto the stand with those dowels. And that's going to be it for today's video. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.